For those of you that maybe aren't aware or haven't heard of it, the Great Replacement is a white nationalist far-right conspiracy theory. It's been debunked to hell and back, but Renaud Camus' original theory basically says that replacist governments are facilitating the replacement of white European populations with non-white people, especially people from countries that are largely populated by Muslims, through increased migration from those countries and a decline in white birth rates. It's described as genocide by substitution. An Icelandic academic called Eiríkur Bergman described the Great Replacement as the following: the claim that immigrants were flocking to predominantly white Christian countries for the precise purpose of rendering the native population a minority within their own land, or even causing their extinction. It's very popular in the United States and in the Republican Party. It has a lot of similarities and overlap with the white genocide conspiracy, but the Great Replacement is much more specifically Islamophobic. It does target people from lots of different backgrounds, including Jewish people, but it explicitly originated as an Islamophobic theory. The original book associates the destruction of white culture and civilization with the presence of Muslims, and I want to focus predominantly on that rather than other versions or interpretations of it that are more general or which target other non-Muslim demographics for reasons that will become clear. To put it concisely, the Great Replacement is an Islamophobic conspiracy theory that claims Muslim immigrants are gradually insinuating themselves into Western populations in order to replace and overthrow them. In the early months of this year, I rewatched every film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I could not think of a better way to segue between those, so I'm just going to talk about this now. When I got to Captain Marvel, I had some very interesting thoughts, and I'd like to share them with you now. I don't like presenting my ideas and my opinions in a way that comes off like I think they're completely original and completely unique. Because usually when I check, I find that my opinions are already being, stated and discussed countless times in countless spaces on the internet. Because a lot of my opinions aren't super obscure, and they're usually based on stuff about the text that's pretty surface level and pretty obvious. But I want to make a small exception here, because I have tried so hard to find other people talking about this online and sharing the opinion that I have about this film, and I haven't been able to. I haven't found it anywhere. Like, I have scoured the internet to the best of my admittedly very limited ability to find even the barest shred of discussion around the topic I'm about to discuss, and I haven't found it anywhere. And so, I'm sure other people have thought of this already. I'm sure people have already made the links and associations that I have, but part of the reason I even wanted to make it a video in the first place is because I haven't seen anyone else talking about it, and I just really want to talk about it. So let me take you on a brief little journey through my personal interpretation of Captain Marvel, which I think is really interesting, which I hope you'll find interesting as well. Now, in case you can't remember Captain Marvel very well, and I wouldn't blame you, it's bad, let me briefly recap some of the film for you. Carol Danvers, going by the name Vers, believes she is a member of the Kree race. It turns out she isn't. It turns out she's a human woman that was transformed into a human Kree hybrid and renamed and brainwashed into serving in the Kree military. But when we meet her at the beginning of the film, she believes herself to be Kree. To briefly quote the Marvel Cinematic Universe wiki, for centuries, the Kree waged war against another race called the Skrulls and created propaganda that fabricated the Skrulls as heartless monsters who use disguise and deception to infiltrate and destroy civilizations from the inside, whilst the Kree themselves are portrayed as selfless and noble heroes. In reality, the Skrulls refused to submit to the Kree Empire. The Kree responded by destroying their home planet Skrullos and sending its survivors to flee scattered throughout the galaxy. So, at the beginning of Captain Marvel, our protagonist is part of a population that have been brainwashed through nationalist propaganda into believing that the Skrulls are hiding among the populations of other planets in order to gradually take over those planets and replace the native populations entirely. In fact, it turns out that's not true. As the film progresses, it turns out that the Skrulls are refugees and that they're seeking a new home because the Kree destroyed their home planet in a war. The Kree displace the Skrulls through warfare, and then when the Skrulls search for a place to live because they've been displaced, they're vilified as insidious and deceptive and trying to destroy native populations in order to take over. This might sound familiar. I don't think it's a stretch, and I don't think I'm reading too much into the film when I say that the Kree are explicitly supposed to represent alt-right white nationalists, and the Skrulls are clearly supposed to represent refugees fleeing to the West after their homes have been destroyed by Western warfare. This is why I wanted to hyper-focus on the Islamophobic aspect at the heart of the Great Replacement conspiracy in particular, because the Skrulls aren't just supposed to represent migrants in general. They're not just supposed to represent marginalised ethnic and cultural groups. The Kree destruction of Skrullos is clearly an allegory for the US military campaigns in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Skrull refugees are clearly supposed to represent refugees from those countries, from Muslim-majority countries. In real life, Muslim refugees flee to the West after being displaced by the West in the first place through warfare, only for Western populations to not only meet them with, suspicion and hostility, but to actively manufacture racist conspiracy theories and nationalist propaganda claiming that they're trying to enact a race replacement. These are clearly the real-life politics being depicted here, and I will admit I find that really interesting. I think the MCU is at its best when it's toying with real politics. Civil War is still one of my favourite films in the franchise, just because of its use of and references to real life and culturally relevant political issues. And the same is true for Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I think that might be my favourite out of the TV shows, and it's because it's based very heavily in real life political issues. Here though, I can't help but feel that it's insensitive, even though the Great Replacement is explicitly depicted in Captain Marvel as being a myth and being white nationalist propaganda and being manufactured by villains. Its use to tell this story in this film just doesn't quite sit right with me. Part of that is because it feels insensitive to depict white nationalist racism that disproportionately affects Muslim communities in the real world through the lens of oh, the blue aliens are fighting the green aliens. And I know that that's just a lot of what the MCU is, but it still feels wrong here. I don't want to be misunderstood. I think it can be, and usually is, a really helpful tool and very appropriate to depict real life issues through metaphor and through allegory, especially in media that's going to be consumed by kids. A really good recent example I can think of is Elemental. From Elemental's promotional material, I expected it to be really shallow and surface level. I thought it was going to be a film about Element City where all of the elements do live in harmony, but for some reason they just kind of can't physically interact with each other because of the consequences, and they can't really have relationships with one another. From the trailers and stuff, I thought the film was going to be about how elements can't mix or have relationships with each other, even though the culture they exist in is already diverse and inclusive, and it doesn't have any specific bigotry directed in any particular direction. And that wouldn't have reflected the real world at all, and that's why I was kind of skeptical going into it. I thought it was going to be anti-racist, but in a way it was explaining it to a baby, where it's stripped down to its bare essentials, and it's just don't be racist, segregation is bad. And that would be fine. That's a good message to send kids, but it seemed like it wasn't going to be really deep or thought-provoking. But then I realised pretty early on, and this was kind of the moment when I knew I was going to enjoy Elemental, I realised pretty early on that it's a film about diaspora specifically. Element City is named that way to sound inclusive, but it isn't actually built to accommodate every element, and Firetown occupies its own area just outside the borders of Element City. It depicts the way that the residents of Firetown feel about the residents of Element City, and vice versa, and it depicts the way that the residents of Firetown are met with open hostility when they do visit Element City. Like Captain Marvel, it's explicitly depicting an issue faced by very specific real-life immigrant communities, but the reason it feels appropriate to pull it off as an allegory in here, the reason it feels appropriate to tell that story through them all just being different elements, is because those countries and those cultures and those people are still represented in the film. The director, Peter Sohn, is a first-generation immigrant from Korea. A lot of the voice cast are South Asian and East Asian, and a lot of effort has been put into making sure the film aesthetically and visually emulates Asian culture. Even the main song from the film, Steal the Show, it sounds Asian. The production on it sounds like Indian music. In short, the reason it feels tasteful and respectful to tell this story through allegory instead of literally in Elemental is because it's not at the expense of erasing the actual cultures and communities that are affected by these issues in real life, and because people from those communities are instrumental in telling the story, and because a lot of effort has been made to, you know, make sure those cultures have representation visually on the screen and in the set design and so on. Captain Marvel is directed, written and almost entirely performed by white people. There are zero writers or directors or performers in the film that come from, you know, Middle Eastern or South Asian or Muslim backgrounds. No one that comes from an environment where they would have been affected by the Islamophobia that the writers are aping to tell this story. And also those cultures aren't represented anywhere in the actual film either. That's why it feels so insensitive to me in Captain Marvel, because the writers are taking real harm and real violence that are inflicted upon people from, you know, Muslim and South Asian and Middle Eastern backgrounds, and they're using it to just tell like a silly little superhero film about how the blue aliens spread malicious propaganda against the green aliens, but the green ones haven't actually done anything wrong. They're all just innocent, and then the blue ones are really the villains. That is an interesting point to touch on, though. I will admit this. The Kree are explicitly depicted as the villains by the end of the film. Carol learns the truth about the Skrulls. She learns that they're innocent and harmless refugees who are just looking for somewhere to live because they were displaced by her people, and she immediately changes allegiance. She sides with the Skrulls and she helps them defeat the Kree. The Great Replacement is depicted in the film as being not only untrue, but actively villainous. So the actual political stance that the film takes and the political message of the film isn't actually like inherently bad. But again, for one, almost everyone at every level of production in the film is white, or at least not from a Muslim background. But also because this is, you know, like a Disney MCU film about a superpower woman who fights villains and defeats evil, Carol obviously is the hero. She saves the day. And when I stop to consider that through the lens of the real races that the alien races are supposed to represent, and when I think about it through the lens of the real life political issues that this film is using to tell its story, it reveals it to be a white saviour narrative. And one of the most egregious examples I can think of. It's about a reformed white nationalist saving like marginalised immigrant communities from white nationalists. And what's more interesting about it is that it turns out she isn't even Kree. It turns out she was a human woman. And when she finds that out, she has absolutely no problem immediately changing her allegiance, immediately siding with the Skrulls, and immediately turning on her own people and defeating them. It means that she has no internal conflict in the film about the fact that she personally has been inflicting military violence against like a marginalised ethnic group. And she doesn't have to struggle emotionally at any point with the fact that her people have been committing acts of like ethnic cleansing and that she's been complicit in a genocide. Just on a film level, I think the narrative would have been strengthened and the themes of the film would have been strengthened if she'd had to struggle at all or faced any consequences for the fact that, like I said, she enacted military violence against people who were innocent and hadn't done anything wrong and were just being unfairly smeared by her own government. But none of that happens in the film. It's all well and good to depict somebody who realises the error of their ways and changes their mind, changes their beliefs, changes their allegiance. But it feels more appropriate to have them directly confront the fact that they were a bigot. It would feel more appropriate if Carol had to confront the fact that she had been complicit in ethnic cleansing. But she doesn't. Nothing comes of it. She finds out the truth about the Skrulls, and she immediately just changes her mind like a flip of a switch, and she's a good guy now. And then it turns out she was never even really a Kree to begin with, so she's essentially given a clean slate without ever actually doing anything to earn one. And now she's just a hero, and she can save the Skrulls from being marginalised. It's a baffling film. Like, its depiction of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory and of white nationalist propaganda is largely accurate, and what it says about them being evil and violent is true. But it's told in like one of the most insensitive ways I could possibly imagine, where it's completely whitewashed. It's told through allegory at the expense of the Skrulls' real-life counterparts having no actual representation in the film, and it's one of the white nationalists that saves the day and rescues everyone without ever having to make amends for, or even really acknowledge at all, that she had a direct personal hand in inflicting violence upon the refugee population. When I wrote my review for Captain Marvel back in February, I wrote that I was glad that the follow-up to this was Ms. Marvel. I couldn't have been more happy that this was followed up by a show that filtered its superhero story and its feminism through a lens of actual Muslim empowerment and depicting actual Muslim characters and actors. And I'm still really glad about that. Like, it's a show that confronts and tackles Islamophobia, literally this time, instead of through like a metaphor, and it's handled really strongly, and from what I can tell, all of the actors are appropriately cast, and it's created by a team of people that come from all sorts of cultural and ethnic backgrounds, including South Asian and Muslim backgrounds. And it's actually really good. It's another one of my favourites of the TV shows on Disney Plus that they've produced. I don't love that Kamala, like, idolises the hell out of Captain Marvel, out of Carol, just because of what I said about her being a white saviour. But I understand that that's not something that the writers of Ms. Marvel were necessarily conscious of, and I understand that they had to set up the dynamic between Kamala and Carol in preparation for the Marvels, and otherwise it's just a really good show that I like a lot. Like, from my perspective, this started out with a film that I thought was terrible and which I hated because it was insensitive towards real-life Muslim refugees, and then it was followed up by a thoughtful and sensitive depiction of Muslim immigrants with actual representation both in front of and behind the camera, and that was a really great thing, and I still think that's a really great thing. That's it. They did it, and we won, and now I'm sure I can just wash my hands of this. For example, I'm really glad the MCU didn't do anything stupid, like releasing a show celebrating South Asian, Middle Eastern and Muslim diaspora, only to release another show 1 year later that is specifically bigoted against them. To be clear, I'm lying. Secret Invasion is an American television miniseries created by Kyle Bradstreet. Nick Fury works with Talos, a shape-shifting alien Skrull, to uncover a conspiracy by a group of renegade Skrulls led by Gravik, who plan to gain control of Earth by posing as different humans around the world. This is a show about a group of Skrulls who gradually and surreptitiously insinuate themselves into the native population of Earth by infiltrating the elite class specifically in order to take over the world and replace its native population with assistance from the government. I don't think I fucking like that. I don't think you get to make a show about how the Great Replacement is a myth and about how Muslim refugees aren't actually trying to invade and take over the West. The West just displaced them using warfare and then didn't like it when they retreated to the West for sanctuary, and then they manufactured nationalist propaganda against them. Only to then turn around and go, they are doing it, and they're doing it because they're angry that they haven't got anywhere to live yet. Captain Marvel, for all its many, many faults, at least says that the Great Replacement is a big, evil lie, and it's a myth and it's not actually happening. And then Secret Invasion is like, yeah, that is happening. I don't think Secret Invasion would be that bad of a premise if Captain Marvel hadn't established that the Skrulls were an allegory for Muslim refugees, but that is a precedent that's been set. I think the idea of an alien race insinuating itself into a population and in order to take over through the government would always throw up red flags that would always feel worrisome, but I think it wouldn't be that much of an issue if none of the alien races were supposed to represent anyone specific, and if the real-life politics it was playing on were more vague. Like, in that case, I think it would have flown under my radar, or it at least wouldn't have looked as bad. But this looks really bad. As a follow-up to Captain Marvel, a story about a race of aliens who are clearly, deliberately coded to represent Muslim immigrants, being discriminated against by being wrongly depicted through propaganda as violent just because they're looking for somewhere to live. This fucking sucks because it's depicting them as committing acts of violence because they're angry that they have nowhere to live. To be clear, it doesn't matter that the Replacist Skrulls are a fringe group and that other Skrulls are working with Nick Fury to uncover and stop them. The Great Replacement and white genocide are either happening or they're not happening, right? And to be clear, they're not happening. But there's no middle ground, and any depiction of refugees doing a Great Replacement still implies that it's absolutely a thing that's real and happening, and that's potentially a bit fucked up if your replacist alien race have been explicitly established as a stand-in for refugees from Muslim backgrounds in prior material. It lends a weird and worrying amount of credibility to a conspiracy theory manufactured by a white nationalist lunatic, and that's a problem. That's Islamophobic. I don't think most audiences are going to pick up on this. I don't think most audiences picked up on it from Captain Marvel, and I don't think they're going to notice it in Secret Invasion. I don't think this is going to make audiences more Islamophobic or anything. But that doesn't matter to me, because you'd think the writers would. Like, I at least would hope that the writers of Secret Invasion had that prior knowledge and that they had an understanding of the political, social context in which Captain Marvel exists and which races are represented by the aliens in the movie. But I guess not, or at least I fucking hope not, because I can't imagine that they did this on purpose, right? But then that being said, I don't know if this actually falls on the writers of the MCU media, because I don't know how much of this is from the source material. I've never read the comics, I'm never gonna read the comics. All of this might be like a really faithful adaptation that already exists in the print media original version. But again, that's another thing that I just sort of don't care about, because copying a source material's bigotry in an adaptation is still bigoted in its own right. Back in 2016 when Ghostbusters came out, I made a review for it, and I would like to quickly show you a brief little clip from it.
There was a worry that I had about Leslie Jones's character, and that was that she was the only one who wasn't a scientist, and she was the only black character. Like, oh yeah, the three white women are the scientists and the black girl is the one with the street smarts. That seemed a bit racist to me, and I wasn't sure how they dealt with it in the original, because I knew that there was a black Ghostbuster in the original. I didn't really understand, like, the origin of it, because I hadn't seen the original yet. And so when I first saw the new one, I thought that was a bit racist, and then I watched the original, and the original is a bit racist. And yeah, they very easily could have changed it for the new one and made it different, but I feel like instead of it being a situation where they're just perpetuating the racist stereotypes, I think they were just using it as a callback to the original.
That's a dumb as shit take, by the way. That's a bad opinion. That's the opinion of a 19-year-old that's only just started to become socially and politically aware and still has a lot of work to do, like another 8 years of work to do, and I would like to revise my position on it. Ghostbusters 2016 has a racism problem, and it's because Ghostbusters 1984 has a racism problem. That doesn't mean the original film is racist and the reboot is just paying it an homage or referencing it. That means both of the films are racist. Equally, if Captain Marvel and Secret Invasion are Islamophobic because there's Islamophobia in the source material, and it's been translated from page to screen without amending it to, you know, remove any of the Islamophobic implications, then that just means that Captain Marvel and Secret Invasion are also just Islamophobic in their own right. I still haven't watched Secret Invasion because it sounds Islamophobic. I might eventually. If I do, it'll be for the sake of being a completionist and because I want to catch up on everything before I watch the Marvels, which also looks bad but not necessarily offensive. But I don't know. I'm just surprised that this is something that no one seems to have picked up on before. I'm surprised that this isn't something I can find, even like a Reddit post without any comments on it saying, like, has anyone noticed this? I couldn't find anything, and I'm a bit surprised, so I just wanted to mention it, wanted to talk about it, let me know what you think. And I don't really know how to end this one, so I guess I'll wrap it up here, but